kiss for you.
First off, this video is spoiler-free, both in its visuals on screen as well as the discussion we'll be having about Silksong. So if you want to watch this without having played the game or without being spoiled, then you can do so, as I will not be showing anything past the first couple of zones. I will not be showing any special powers or anything like that, and I will try to keep the discussion here to a general game design influence versus something about specific mechanics therein. So this video's title is mainly talking about Silksong in the way of it being your first Metroidvania, and I think in the discussion of trying to understand, what that really means, is you first have to understand what Hollow Knight actually is. So Silksong, and by extension Hollow Knight, are what I would qualify as precision platforming Metroidvanias. And we'll kind of break that down here. Metroidvanias in general are, just broadly speaking, the combination of Castlevania map layout and level design, which tends to focus on interconnected spaces with shortcuts connecting each of these zones. And Metroid games come back later, progression style of structure, where you'll find new tools and abilities that allow you to unlock new areas in places that you've been to before, right? The ability to backtrack to areas you've already been to and unlock new sections of them with the new tools you have gathered. A lot of games use the Metroid progression structure, like JRPGs, but are not necessarily Metroidvanias. Few games, however, tend to use the Castlevania map design that are not Metroidvanias, so that's kind of how the distinction of that works. The other piece of this package of kind of understanding what Hollow Knight is the platforming part. Platforming Metroidvanias, generally speaking, are quite rare. Ori and Hollow Knight, while being the best examples, are quite old at this point, and they are the best examples because they are the prime examples. This is quite a rare genre of Metroidvania, subgenre. Most other Metroidvanias tend to be focused on things like action or puzzle solving. For instance, Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown, Ender Magnolia, Blasphemous, and Nine Souls, which are the previous four crowning jewels of the Metroidvania genre, are all action Metroidvanias, generally speaking, which are primarily based on the combat and enemy encounters of the game, with things like Nine Souls and Ender Magnolia also tapping into strong story and narrative elements. However, because of this kind of distinction between the more action-focused Metroidvanias and the platforming ones that Hollow Knight actually is, many people's exposure to Metroidvanias can easily be from other games and other Metroidvanias that don't necessarily hone in on the platforming nearly as much. And this is even more true of the final piece here, which is the precision part. Precision platformers are also quite rare, and the fact that Celeste and Super Meat Boy are the best examples, and both of them being 7 years old, showcases how old some of the best examples, can get in terms of there's not really a recent go-to precision platformer. So to go from a relatively unknown genre of precision platformers to a mega smash hit of Hollow Knight, which sells 15 million copies, is definitely quite a feat. Because of this, and the kind of broad appeal of something that was relatively niche, it can also lead to a lot of incorrect assumptions. And the first of which is what we'll get into here. So this is kind of just setting the stage to set up what Hollow Knight and what Silksong actually are, which is precision platformer Metroidvanias, combining the precision platformers of like Celeste with the more Metroidvania discoverability. It's something that is quite rare in the genre. So this is not just like a straight shot Metroidvania. On that same note, something like Silksong was supposed to be a DLC for Hollow Knight, and even 8 years later, that is absolutely still the case. And one of the ways it showcases that is effectively in its scaling, as well as the difficulty tuning, I would say. This game is quite hard, way more so than Hollow Knight, way more so than most Souls games, way more so than most precision platformers. And it's hard because it's combining the dexterity and execution of precision platformers with the combat and movesets of something like a Sekiro-style game. What I mean by that is it is one character with one weapon, you got some tools, and you have a lot of different enemies and movesets to take down. And it's that combination that's pretty unique, but it's also, I think, way different than most people sort of realize. It's not really until you get to play the game yourself for a couple hours and really feel out the character that it becomes apparent that this game is not Hollow Knight. That game was primarily a straight action Metroidvania with some optional platforming challenges that you could embark on, the Path of Pain, that kind of thing. This game here is a full platforming, Silksong is a full platforming Metroidvania with significantly more punishing enemies and level design. And that is really important to know because as we're kind of understanding now, Silksong, and by extension Hollow Knight, but more primarily Silksong, are precision platforming Metroidvanias, combining those two elements, and that is going to be significantly harder than something like in Hollow Knight 1, which is more straight action focused, or some other Metroidvanias that are less focused on the platforming aspects of it. On top of that, on top of just the general more focus on platforming, Silksong also is considerably harder and some other key changes. So if you qualify these as spoilers, then just, be warned. So some of the things that Silksong changes from Hollow Knight are the general tendency to have things just deal more damage, whether that be floor hazards or enemies or anything like that. They'll deal 2 hearts of damage, which is more than most enemies did in Hollow Knight 1. There is a greater moveset on a variety of these enemies, so instead of just having, the enemies do 1 or 2 attacks, you'll have enemies doing 3 or 4 attacks and jumping around, so that makes it hard to deal with. A massive one that I think will absolutely be changed later on, and we'll get to explaining why, is no loot on bosses, and this is, or most bosses anyway. And this is something that is a contention point beyond just the general critiques on things like difficulty. It's the fact that when you beat most bosses in this game, you will not get anything. Beyond maybe the access to the new area, they may have some stuff for you, but most of the actual bosses don't drop anything, which is quite disappointing, considering the first game you'd beat a boss and you'd be showered with geo. Some other things, economy-wise, there's less resources for most mobs, meaning a lot of mobs don't drop resources. They do still drop shards, but they don't drop the main resources you'll be dealing with, so that is quite, makes the economy kind of tighter. As well as the fact that more of the things you need in the game, like benches and travel points, require this. So in the first game, it was like some of the time you would need some currency to be able to get fast travel locations, right? Or get rest areas to heal, that kind of thing. And there's definitely more of that here, and there's less opportunities to get those resources. Silksong is also quite linear, not to say that the first Hollow Knight was not linear, but it is quite a linear Metroidvania, so compared to other ones that may be a little bit more free-flowing in terms of how you access things, there's really only one set path with some optional bosses along the way, meaning it becomes quite difficult if you wanted to do farming of resources or coming back later kind of thing, right? This is not an Elden Ring situation where the freedom allows you to do a bunch of different things if it's too hard. If something's too hard, you gotta practice, you gotta get better at it. More precise platforming, as we mentioned before, and the enemy respawn timer is significantly shorter, and it feels like enemies respawn quite quickly. So everything here that I just mentioned really showcases the fact that this was being designed as a DLC. It is much more precise, challenging, and it's also not focused on rewards, which I think is a big thing that we're going to be talking about here. The biggest issue of all those that I mentioned really is no rewards on loot on bosses, and I guess the best way I can describe this is kind of talking about what this actually means in the context of it being, or supposed to have been a DLC. In a DLC, especially one set primarily after the end game of Hollow Knight, the bosses wouldn't need to give things like rewards because there is nothing new that you need to be gained. Oftentimes DLC that has optional bosses like Cuphead, for instance, or the Cuphead DLC is just a bunch of new bosses. You're not going to necessarily get anything for that because it's supposed to be mostly post-game stuff or additional content. It's not necessarily setting up for a major expansion with a whole new reset, right? You may get some new cosmetics, but generally speaking, this optional post-game DLC don't need anything to get the player engaged and wanting to do it. This, however, changes dramatically when you introduce the idea of an expansion. Think Monster Hunter Iceborne, Lies of P Overture, Elden Ring, Shadow of the Erdtree, where these new encounters become the new standard set by the game. In Iceborne, for instance, you beat the base game, you get Iceborne expansion, and then the new new monsters you fight immediately give you that effectively new baseline level gear, effectively restarting the gear grind, if you will, at a new baseline level with harder mobs. Right, that's typically how most of these expansions work. Iceborne, in this case, is at the end of Monster Hunter Worlds. Lies of P Overture is at the middle. Elden Ring is at the middle, but they, generally speaking, create a new ground floor for new things to occur and create a different standard, if you will. Unfortunately, Silksong is not built like that. It's not built like a full expansion for the new standard. It's built primarily like an optional DLC, which is to say, very little rewards, and it's just mostly things you can do if you want a challenge. The problem is that this ultimately hurts the game's ability as a full game to be rewarding and give players what they need to keep on playing. The largest barrier to people kind of enjoying this game and being interested in it as their first Metroidvania is going to be the lack of satisfying rewards you get for challenging fights. So now that we've kind of established what the game is and what it is set up as, how is the game in general? which is kind of where we get into some good things. Well, I would generally say that beyond the balancing issues, which I think can be relatively easily tuned up in an update 2, the rest of the game is a pinnacle of its craft and absolutely deserves all the other praise that it's getting. There's a lot of polish and detail paid to it that it does kind of make the fact that the balancing sucks a little bit more annoying, because it hurts what is undoubtedly, in any other capacity, one of the best Metroidvanias ever, if not staying atop with things like the original and stuff like Nine Souls, if you compare it to that. And I would say ultimately that kind of thing comes down to 3 things. And these are kind of things that now, if you are not aware of Silksong, or you haven't really been following Hollow Knight or anything like that, this is where we get into stuff that you might want to pay attention to, because this is now no longer setup. It's talking about, the actual game and why people care about this and why this game sold so much, right? So for understanding it as your first Metroidvania, the 3 things that really stand out to most people about the game are the atmosphere / the world building, the movement, and the characters. And obviously atmosphere is pretty easy to tell, right? The game looks amazing, hand-drawn, very nice aesthetic art, very good music, nice sound effects and sound design. The world is interesting and it's built up and it's all relatively consistent, and that does a lot, because a lot of Metroidvanias don't bother with any of that, right? Prince of Persia, The Lost Crown, I would say Ender Magnolia, Nine Souls, right? They all have relatively decent atmospheres, but their world building isn't all that good, right? There's a lot of disjointed parts and pieces, and not to say those aren't good games, but, the world building in Hollow Knight is something that is exceptionally strong. I would say the only one that kind of rivals it is something like Blasphemous, having really good kind of gothic cathedral level stuff, right? In a Spanish war, that kind of thing. I think that is definitely rivaling it and sometimes surpassing it in just raw imagery. But I think Hollow Knight absolutely takes the cake for a full, well-rounded package when it comes to the atmosphere and the world building. For movement, this is something that, again, as a precision or even just a platforming Metroidvania, this has over many of the other games. Most Metroidvanias do not have crazy movement because their focus is on the combat encounters and the discoverability of its map, rather than its actual movement and its character feel. This is something that Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown did extremely well as well, with its combat and its movement, and it kind of expanded to giving you time forward and backward mechanics and skipping and that kind of thing that helped it stand out. Hollow Knight was obviously the start of that. Again, things like Ori as well. But movement is definitely a highlight here. The amount of options you have for movement, right? Most of these, you have a double jump, you have a dash, you have sprint, and you have, different effectively pogo options, downward pogo, and then you have a diagonal pogo. You can do all things, and you have some other things I will not spoil. I'm not getting into spoilers or anything like that. There's some other movement options that come in some pretty unique ways than just the standard stuff you would expect, right, from this kind of game or for what you've seen. So the movement's definitely a highlight here, and it lends itself well to the precision platforming element of the game. The third thing, and the thing that kind of really brings it all together, is you could have good world building, you have good movement, but if you don't have good characters, it doesn't really feel like, a world. And I would say this is something I think where Hollow Knight excels at in its relatively small scope in the grand scheme of things. It can pay a lot of attention to its characters, right? And more so its character designs, its character motifs, its character kind of just general experience. These designs are very good. They look great in animation and how they operate. They're somewhat voiced, right? That gives good characterization there. There's dialogue here. It's generally speaking pretty well written. So these characters, even if they're not NPCs, you're not really having a bunch of story characters, but they make the world interesting. They I want to see what this character has to say and what this is, right? Oftentimes they're vendors or things, but they just have so much involvement and so much care put into them by the 3 people here for the dev team that it really stands out as something to be noted. And definitely of any element you can praise Hollow Knight and Hollow Knight Silksong for, those would be the 3 that I definitely would look at. Beyond that, there's some other things here relating to kind of like the map and how the map lays out and all that stuff. Assuming it is your kind of relatively your first Metroidvania or trying to use it as your first Metroidvania, I think the thing that I kind of noticed about the Hollow Knight map is the fact that it's a little bit cumbersome by design. So I'm not gonna, again, not trying to get into spoilers, but functionally, you have to buy your maps. So you have to like find the map person. They'll be like singing a song, right? And you'll be able to buy your maps there. You'll be able to buy a quill that allows you to update the maps every time you sit on a rest area. And then you'll be able to kind of see where you are. You'll be able to see, the map of the area and this stuff and what you need to explore and what you haven't. And then you have to buy and equip a compass in order to be able to actually see where you are on the map. So it's a little bit cumbersome. You don't just have a map by default like most other Metroidvanias. You have to find the person in the new area that you're in to get a map of that area, and then you have to equip the compass in order to have like a location track of where you are. So that's kind of just how the map system works. Every new area has a new map that you have to buy. You only have to buy the quill, the thing that lets you like update the map once. So that's just like a one-time purchase, right? And then most of the other things, luckily, most of the other things are automatic. So if you buy like bench pins, for instance, those will be marked on your map. If you buy, fast travel pins, those will be marked on your map. Generally speaking, while it is a lot more cumbersome than something like Prince of Persia or even Nine Souls, with its map design, I think it adds to the level of immersion that the game can have, where you actually have to go to a character that's mapping out the area and buy a map from them and buy a quill to update it, right? There's a lot of immersion there that I think doesn't necessarily come across in a lot of other Metroidvanias or even games in general. So I do really appreciate that kind of attention to detail and in the world building and how that kind of lends itself to it. That's a benefit and a curse in a lot of ways, because while it is very nice, it does lead to things being a little cumbersome. The other thing that is definitely not going to be to everyone's taste is just the general backtracking amount, I would say. I, generally speaking, am not a fan of Metroidvanias, or tend to not be a fan, because of not wanting to miss out on things and backtracking, which is like basically the entire point of the genre. The backtracking is interesting in this game because oftentimes it's backtracking because you died and you have to run back to where you were before in order to get your stuff, right? Souls type things. And that's fine, that's not an issue. The bigger problem is when you need to backtrack on areas because you open the map and you see a little like out, you see like a way out or like a new way you haven't been to, right? And you go in and realize, oh yeah, it's blocked by a keyhole, or oh yeah, it's blocked by a gate I can't access, right? Or oh yeah, I already know what this is because it leads to a different map that you already have, but it doesn't show you on the map, right? Those things are kind of annoying because, you go into something and it's like, oh, let's just say it's a place where you can pick up like a shard of something, right? Or a key, something, right? There'll be a glowing thing on the bottom, you can pick it up. That won't populate. Even if you go to a bench and try and update the map, that section there doesn't populate. And that's really annoying because it's like I've done everything in this like little hole basically I went into, and it doesn't show me. So now if I come back later and forget that that hole leads to that thing, I go into it and I'm like, oh yeah, I've already been here, right? So I've just noticed that happening a lot more in Hollow Knight and Silksong than it is in other Metroidvanias, where you like forget that you went to a place and then realize either it's blocked or you've already been there. So I would say definitely the barriers to entry in terms of this game are definitely those two things. It's how the map operates and how the backtracking ties into the map, and the fact that it's never really that clear if you've been through a section. It's always clear if you unlock the section of the map because it will have like a full map instead of just the sketch lines of it. But it's not always clear, does this new thing over here lead to something I can go through, or does it lead to a thing I've already been to, right? And so that's kind of annoying. And the reason I mention this is because I'm also playing something Ender Magnolia, and they have a really cool section where like it's color coded on the map of like if you've completed that zone or not. And so it will tell you, hey, you've completed the zone, or you completed the area, or you haven't. And that can kind of help you make sure, oh, I've completed the zone, I don't need to go back here, right? I don't think that this game necessarily needs something like that, but I would like a little bit more clarity in terms of, hey, have I been here already? Are we good to go, or are we not good to go, right? Just as a kind of personal complaint here. But overall, I would say that if you're trying to get this game as your first Metroidvania, I think it's going to be a good one. There's a reason Hollow Knight sold as well as it did, and even though my complaints on backtracking and map, sort of like the difficulty things are definitely things to take note, they don't detract from the fact that this is still a wonderful experience, and while there's things that do need to be tweaked, like no loot on bosses and some maybe of the difficulty tuning, the things that make Hollow Knight unique, I wouldn't take away from it. I wouldn't want an easier map system or less backtracking, because I think the things that make Hollow Knight itself and give it its identity are really the things that still make it unique, right? I don't want to homogenize it by saying, hey, this great thing from Ender Magnolia needs to be in every single one, right? Because then it doesn't feel like you're trying something new. It just feels like you're shoveling all the advancements into one thing, right? Oftentimes that can make the game feel maybe too easy or too watered down. Hollow Knight Silksong doesn't feel like that, and I think it's an absolute testament that even 8 years later, past its initial release, Hollow Knight is still doing something in gaming and in Metroidvanias that feels unique as it relates to its world building, its movement, its characters, and the way the map works, right? It's all relatively still unique, which is impressive considering it's had 8 years of other games to kind of try and one-up it, and it still stands among some of the best you can play. So that is an absolutely incredible achievement, and I don't want to kind of take that away from it. It's also, again, only $20 on pretty much all platforms and all that stuff. I'm not going to recommend it necessarily. I will say, hey, you should check it out. I think it can work as your, your platformer, not platformer, your Metroidvania if you want it, but I'm not going to wholeheartedly recommend it because this is not really a review. I haven't played enough of it. I'm about 8.5 hours into it at the moment, which is the most I've ever had from a Metroidvania. I guess I should mention that. All the other ones, this is my 6th one, I think, and all the other ones I haven't really gotten into a ton. This is the one that kind of really got me, even though I do think, as I mentioned, some of the things there that could be better. And I want to make this video to kind of talk about that. I'm like, this is functionally speaking, my first Metroidvania, and I wanted to talk about it and see if it could be yours too. So if you like this kind of thing and want to see more of this stuff on the channel, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe, do all that, and I'll see everyone in the next video.